Hello.
Hey there, just starting up now.
Okie doke.
Well, maybe that's not the best way to do this. Let's try this again. Come on. Oh, it's not going to do that. All righty then. I guess let's go back and do it this way. Okie dokie. Welcome to Weekly Marks, um, 3rd of May, 2025. We're continuing on with theories of surplus value, mainly from the um, Marxist Internet Archives, and but it did get published at one moment in a collection in 2013. We're up to chapter 7, which is very short, and then chapter 8. The way we're doing this is to scroll through the text while we listen to an audio presentation of this. Um, I may run it at 1.25 playback speed for a variety of reasons, but I think if you want to replay it once it gets posted at other speeds, you certainly feel free to do that. This is also a challenge for yours and my reading ability. So, needless to say, why we do this or why I'm doing this is just simply to get this down, um, to provide an incentive for some people to consider, even if it isn't the lost chapter 4 of Capital, um, to consider some of the elements within it that are they're little fragments that are, I think, worthwhile. I think I'll go back in and ultimately do a little time on the Saturday session to not summarize the whole thing because that would be a little bit crazy, but to pick out some, I think, important elements. Now, noting when this was written, there are things that change, of course, and I think in the context of the as Fred Mosley has done with the translations of 1864 to 67, see how some of these things get absorbed into uh, stuff that Marx talks about relative to surplus value. It is still an important concept and certainly relates to a whole variety of other elements that have to do with productivist views, the role of surplus value on the Department 2 side, a variety of stuff. And all of these are still worthwhile, I would assert. Uh, some people will just say that, well, all this gets kind of compressed into the volume one that we're currently looking at in its 2024 translation. But I don't think that's sufficient. And as I think many readers of Capital Volume 1 note, that there's a lot of useful and interesting compressions into the published Volume 1. Um, but I think there's other ideas that I think we still need to address, not only because of the that this that theories of surplus value sort of sit out there because of a variety of other reasons, sit there in history, and get less attended to, much like the Grundrisse or the attention to the Grundrisse that has been sort of reemerges, and of course the 1844 economic philosophic manuscripts, etc. So there's all those things, and I think that this fits in that same whatever canon. So here we go.
Linguet, early critique of the bourgeois liberal view of the freedom of the laborer. In accordance with the plan of this work, socialist and communist writers are entirely excluded from the historical reviews. These reviews are only intended to show, on the one hand, in what form the political economists criticized each other, and on the other hand, the historically determining forms in which the laws of political economy were first stated and further developed. In dealing with surplus value, I therefore exclude such 18th century writers as Brissot, Godwin, and the like, and likewise the 19th century socialists and communists. The few socialist writers, whom I shall come to speak of in this survey, either themselves adopt the standpoint of bourgeois economy, or contest it from its own standpoint. Linguet, however, is not a socialist. His polemics against the bourgeois liberal ideals of the Enlighteners, his contemporaries, against the dominion of the bourgeoisie that was then beginning, are given, half seriously, half ironically, a reactionary appearance. He defends Asiatic despotism against the civilized European forms of despotism. Thus, he defends slavery against wage labor. Quote, "In our civilized countries, all the elements of nature are slaves. In order to get a hold of some of this wealth appropriated by the rich, it must be purchased with heavy labor, which increases the wealth of these rich persons. Thus it is that all captive nature has ceased to offer to these children resources of easy access for the maintenance of their life. Its favors must be paid for by assiduous toil, and its gifts by stubborn labors." Here, in the gifts of nature, the physiocratic view is echoed. The rich man, who has appropriated to himself the exclusive possession of it, only at this price consents to restore even the smallest part of it to the community. In order to be allowed to share in its treasures, it is necessary to labor to increase them. One must then renounce this chimera of liberty. Laws exist in order to sanctify a primary usurpation of private property and to prevent new usurpations. They are, as it were, a conspiracy against the greater part of the human race. That is, against those who own no property. It is society which has produced these laws, and not the laws which have produced society. Property existed before the laws. Society itself, the fact that man lives in society and not as an independent, self-supporting animal, is the root of property, of the laws based on it, and of the inevitable slavery. On the one hand, there were peaceful and isolated husbandmen and shepherds. On the other hand, quote, "Hunters accustomed to live by blood, to gather together in bands the more easily to entrap and fell the beasts on which they fed, and to concert together on the division of the spoils. It is among the hunters that the first signs of society must have appeared. Real society came into being at the expense of the shepherds or husbandmen, and was founded on their subjection, by a band of hunters who had joined hands. All duties of society were resolved into commanding and obeying. This degradation of a part of the human race, after it had produced society, gave birth to laws. Stripped of the conditions of production, the laborers are compelled by need to labor to increase the wealth of others, in order themselves to live. It is the impossibility of living by any other means that compels our farm laborers to till the soil whose fruits they will not eat, and our masons to construct buildings in which they will not live. It is want that drags them to those markets where they await masters who will do them the kindness of buying them. It is want that compels them to go down on their knees to the rich man in order to get from him permission to enrich him. Violence, then, has been the first cause of society, and force the first bond that held it together. Men's first care was doubtless to provide themselves with food. The second must have been to seek to provide themselves with it without labor. They could only achieve this by appropriating to themselves the fruit of other men's labor. The first conquerors only made themselves despots so that they could be idle with impunity, and kings in order to have something to live on, and this greatly narrows and simplifies the idea of domination. Society is born of violence, and property of usurpation. As soon as there were masters and slaves, society was formed. From the beginning, the two pillars of the civil union were on the one hand the slavery of the greater part of the men, and on the other the slavery of all the women. It was at the cost of 3/4 of its members that society assured the happiness, the opulence, the ease of the small number of property owners whom alone it had in view. The question, therefore, is not to examine whether slavery is contrary to nature in itself, but whether it is contrary to the nature of society. It is inseparable from it. Society and civil servitude were born together. Permanent slavery, the indestructible foundation of societies. Men have only been reduced to depend for their subsistence on the liberality of another man when the latter, by despoiling them, has become rich enough to be able to return a small portion to them. His feigned generosity could be no more than a restitution of some part of the fruits of their labors which he had appropriated. Does not servitude consist in this obligation to sow without reaping for oneself, to sacrifice one's well-being to that of another, to labor without hope? And did not its real epoch begin from the moment when there were men whom the whip and a few measures of oats when they were brought to the stable could compel to labor? It is only in a fully developed society that food seems to the poor starveling a sufficient equivalent for his liberty. But in society in its early stages, free men would be struck with horror at this unequal exchange. It could only be proposed for captives. Only after they have been deprived of the enjoyment of all their faculties can the exchange become a necessity for them. The essence of society consists in freeing the rich man from labor, giving him new organs, untiring members which take upon themselves all the laborious operations, the fruits of which he is to appropriate. That is the plan which slavery allows him to carry out without embarrassment. He buys men who are to serve him. In suppressing slavery, no claim was made that either wealth or its advantages were suppressed. It was therefore necessary that things should remain the same except in name. It has always been necessary for the majority of men to continue to live in the pay of and in dependence on the minority, which has appropriated to itself all wealth. Slavery has therefore been perpetuated on the earth, but under a sweeter name. Among us now, it is adorned with the title of service. By these servants, Linguet says, he does not mean lackeys and the like. The towns in the countryside are peopled by another kind of servant, more widely spread, more useful, more laborious, and known by the name of journeymen, handicraftsmen, etc. They are not dishonored by the brilliant colors of luxury. They sigh beneath the loathsome rags which are the uniform of penury. They never share in the abundance of which their labor is the source. Wealth seems to grant them a favor when it kindly accepts the presents that they make to it. It is for them to be grateful for the services which they render to it. It pours on them the most outrageous contempt, while they are clasping its knees, imploring permission to be useful to it. It has to be pleaded with to grant this, and in this particular exchange of real generosity for an imaginary favor, arrogance and disdain are on the side of the receiver, and servility, anxiety, and eagerness on the side of the giver. These are the servants who have truly replaced the serfs among us. The point that has to be examined is this: what effective gain the suppression of slavery has brought to them? I say with as much sorrow as frankness, all that they have gained is to be every moment tormented by the fear of death from hunger, a calamity that at least never visited their predecessors in this lowest rank of mankind. He is free, you say. That is his misfortune. He is bound to no one, but also no one is bound to him. When he is needed, he is hired at the cheapest price possible. The meager wage that he is promised is hardly equal to the price of his subsistence for the day, which he gives in exchange. He is given overlookers to compel him to fulfill his task quickly. He is hard-driven. He is goaded on for fear that a skillfully concealed and only too comprehensible laziness may make him hold back half his strength, for fear that the hope of remaining employed longer on the same task may stay in his hands and blunt his tools. The sordid economy that keeps a restless watch on him overwhelms him with reproaches at the slightest respite he seems to allow himself, and claims to have been robbed if he takes a moment's rest. When he is finished, he is dismissed as he was taken on, with the coldest indifference, and without any concern as to whether the 20 or 30 sous that he has just earned for a hard day's labor will be enough to keep him if he finds no work the following day. He is free. That is precisely why I pity him. For that reason, he is much less cared for in the labors in which he is used. His life is much more readily hazarded. The slave was precious to his master because of the money he had cost him, but the handicraftsman cost nothing to the rich voluptuary who employs him. Men's blood had some price in the days of slavery. They were worth at least as much as they could be sold for in the market. Since they have no longer been sold, they have no real intrinsic value. A pioneer is much less valued in an army than a pack horse, because the horse is very costly and the pioneer can be had for nothing. The suppression of slavery brought these military calculations into civil life, and since that epoch there has been no prosperous bourgeois who does not calculate in this way, as heroes do. The day laborers are born, grow up, and are trained for, they are bred for the service of wealth without causing it the slightest expense, like the game that it massacres over its estates. It seems as if it really has the secret of which the unfortunate Pompey vainly boasted. Wealth has only to stamp on the ground, and from it emerge legions of hard-working men who contend among themselves for the honor of being at its disposal. If one among this crowd of mercenaries, putting up its buildings or keeping its gardens straight, disappears, the place that he has left empty is an invisible point, which is immediately covered again without any intervention from anyone. A drop of the water of a great river is lost without regret, because new torrents incessantly succeed it. It is the same with workers. The ease with which they can be replaced fosters the rich man's hard-heartedness towards them. This is the form used by Linguet, not yet capitalist. These men, it is said, have no master. Pure abuse of the word. What does it mean they have no master? They have one, and the most terrible, the most imperious of masters, that is, need. It is this that reduces them to the most cruel dependence. It is not one man in particular whose orders they must obey, but the orders of all in general. It is not a single tyrant whose whims they have to humor, and whose benevolence they have to court, which would set a limit to their servitude and make it endurable. They become the valets of anyone who has money, which gives their slavery an infinite compass and severity. It is said that if they don't get on well with one master, they at least have the consolation that they can tell him so and the power to make a change, but that the slaves have neither the one nor the other. They are therefore all the more wretched. What sophistry! For bear in mind that the number of those who make others work is very small, and the number of workers, on the contrary, is immense. What is this apparent liberty which you have bestowed on them, reduced to, for them? They live only by hiring out their arms. They must therefore find someone to hire them, or die of hunger. Is that to be free? What is most terrible is that the very smallness of this pay is another reason for producing it. The more the day laborer is driven by want, the cheaper he sells himself. The greater the urgency of his need, the less profitable is his labor. The despots, for the moment, whom he beseeches with tears to accept his services, feel no shame in, as it were, feeling his pulse, to assure themselves that he has enough strength left. They fix the reward that they offer him by the degree of his weakness. The nearer they think he is to death from starvation, the more they deduct from what could keep him from it. And what scraps that they do give him is less to prolong his life than to delay his death. The independence of the day laborer is one of the most baneful scourges that the refinement of modern times has produced. It augments the wealth of the rich and the poverty of the poor. The one saves everything that the other spends. What the latter is forced to economize is not from his superfluity, but from what is indispensable to him. If today it is so easy to maintain these prodigious armies which join with luxury in order to bring about the extinction of the human race, it is only due to the suppression of slavery. It is only since there have no longer been slaves that debauchery and beggary make heroes at 5 sous a day. I find this, that is, Asiatic slavery, 100 times more preferable than any other way of existing, for men reduced to having to win their livelihood by daily labor. The slaves and the laborers' chains are made of the same material and only differently colored. Here they are black and seem heavy. There they look less gloomy and seem hollower, but weigh them impartially and you will find no difference between them. Both are equally forged by necessity. They have precisely the same weight. Or rather, if they are a few grains more in one case, it is in the one whose external appearance proclaims that it is lighter. Linguet here calls to the men of the French Enlightenment in regard to the laborers. Do you not see that the subjection, the annihilation, since it must be said, of this large part of the flock creates the wealth of the shepherds? Believe me, in his interest, in yours, and even in theirs, leave them with the conviction that they have that this cur who yelps at them is stronger by himself than they all are together. Let them flee with stupid fright at the mere sight of his shadow. Everyone benefits from it. It'll make it easier for you to gather them in to fleece them for yourself. They are more easily guarded from being devoured by wolves. It is true, only to be eaten by men. But anyway, that is their fate from the moment they have entered a stable. Before talking of releasing them from there, start by overthrowing the stable. That is to say, society. End of Part 1. Part 2. Chapter 8. Rodbertus, New Theory of Rent. Section 1. Excess surplus value in agriculture. Agriculture develops slower than industry under conditions of capitalism. The following remark has to be made beforehand. Supposing the necessary wage is equal to 10 hours, then this is most easily explained in the following manner. If 10 hours labor, i.e. a sum of money equal to 10 hours, enabled the agricultural laborer, on an average, to purchase all the necessary means of subsistence, agricultural and industrial products, etc., then this is the average wage for unskilled labor. We are thus concerned here with the value of his daily product, which must fall to his share. In the first place, this value exists in the form of the commodity which he produces, i.e. in a certain quantity of this commodity, in exchange for which, after deducting what he himself consumes of the commodity, if he does consume any of it, he can procure for himself the necessary means of subsistence. Not only the use value which he himself produces, but industry, agriculture, etc., thus come into the estimation of his necessary income. But this is inherent in the concept of commodity. He produces a commodity, not merely a product. We need therefore waste no words about this. Rodbertus first investigates the situation in a country where there is no separation between land ownership and ownership of capital, and here he comes to the important conclusion that rent, by which he means the entire surplus value, is simply equal to the unpaid labor, or the quantity of products which it represents. In the first instance, it is noteworthy that Rodbertus only takes into account the growth of relative surplus value, i.e. the growth of surplus value insofar as it arises out of growing productivity of labor, and not the growth of surplus value derived from the prolongation of the working day itself. All absolute surplus value is of course relative in one respect. Labor must be sufficiently productive for the worker not to require all of his time to keep himself alive. But from this point, the distinction comes into force. Incidentally, if originally labor is but little productive, the needs are also extremely simple, as with slaves, and the masters themselves do not live much better than the servants. The relative productivity of labor necessary before a profit-monger, a parasite, can come into being is very small. If we find a high rate of profit, though labor is as yet very unproductive, and machinery, division of labor, etc. are not used, then this is the case only under the following circumstances. Either, as in India, partly because the requirements of the worker are extremely small, and he is depressed even below his modest needs, but partly also because low productivity of labor is identical with the relatively small fixed capital in proportion to the share of capital which is spent on wages. Or, and this comes to the same thing, with a relatively high proportion of capital laid out in wages in relation to the total capital. Or finally, because labor time is excessively long. The latter is the case in countries such as Austria, etc., where the capitalist mode of production is already in existence, but which have to compete with far more developed countries. Wages can be low here, partly because the requirements of the worker are less developed, partly because agricultural products are cheaper, or, and this amounts to the same thing as far as the capitalist is concerned, because they have less value in terms of money. Hence, the quantity of the product of, say, 10 hours labor, which must go to the worker as necessary wages, is small. If, however, he works 17 hours instead of 12, then this can make up for the low productivity of labor. In any case, because in a given country the value of labor is falling relatively to its productivity, it must not be imagined that wages in different countries are inversely proportional to the productivity of labor. In fact, exactly the opposite is the case. The more productive one country is relative to another in the world market, the higher will be its wages as compared with the other. In England, not only the nominal wages but also the real wages are higher than on the continent. The worker eats more meat, he satisfies more needs. This, however, only applies to the industrial worker and not the agricultural laborer. But the wages of the English workers are not higher in proportion to the productivity of their labor. Quite apart from the variation in rent according to the fertility of the land, the very existence of rent, i.e. the modern form of landed property, is feasible because the average wage of the agricultural laborer is below that of the industrial worker. Since to start with, by tradition, as the farmer first turns capitalist before capitalists turn farmers, the capitalist passed on part of his gain to the landlord. He compensated himself by forcing wages down below their level. With the workers' desertion of the land, wages had to rise, and they did rise. But hardly has this pressure become evident when machinery, etc. is introduced and the land once more boasts a relative surplus population. Surplus value can be increased without the extension of labor time or the development of the productive power of labor, by forcing wages below their traditional level. And indeed this is the case wherever agricultural production is carried on by capitalist methods. Where it cannot be achieved by means of machinery, it is done by turning the land over to sheep grazing. Here then, we already have a potential basis of rent, since in fact, the agricultural laborer's wage does not equal the average wage. This rent would be feasible quite independent of the price of the product, which is equal to its value. Ricardo is also aware of the second type of rent increase, which arises from a greater product sold at the same price, but he does not take it into account, since he measures rent per quarter and not per acre. He would not say that rent has risen, and in this way rent can rise with falling prices, because 20 quarters at 2 shillings is more than 10 quarters at 2 shillings, or 10 quarters at 3 shillings. Incidentally, however the phenomenon of rent may be explained, the significant difference between agriculture and industry remains, and that in the latter, excess surplus value is created by cheaper production, in the former by dearer production. If the average price of 1 pound of yarn is 2 shillings, and I can produce it for 1 shilling, then in order to gain an increased market for it, I will necessarily sell it for 1 shilling 6pence, or at any rate below 2 shillings. And what is more, this is absolutely necessary, for cheaper production presupposes production on a larger scale. So compared with before, I am now glutting the market. I must sell more than before. Although 1 pound of yarn costs only 1 shilling, this is only the case if I now produce, say, 10,000 pounds as against my previous 8,000. The low cost is only achieved because fixed capital is spread over 10,000 pounds. If I were to sell only 8,000 pounds, the depreciation of the machines alone would raise the price per pound on the value of my product, which is 1 shilling, and which already includes the normal profit. In any case, I am hereby forcing down the market price with the result that the consumer gets the product more cheaply. But in agriculture, I sell at 2 shillings, since if I had sufficient fertile land, the less fertile would not be cultivated. If the area of fertile land were enlarged, or the fertility of the poorer soil so improved that I could satisfy demand, then this game would end. Not only does Ricardo not deny this, but he expressly calls attention to it. Thus, if we admit that the varying fertility of the land accounts not for rent itself, but only for the differences in rent, there remains the law that while in industry, on an average, excess profit arises from the lowering of the price of the product, in agriculture the relative size of rent is determined not only by the relative raising of the price, raising the price of the product of fertile land above its value, but by selling the cheaper product at the cost of the dearer. This is, however, as I have already demonstrated, merely the law of competition, which does not emanate from the soil, but from capitalist production. Furthermore, Ricardo would be right in another respect, except that in the manner of the economists, he turns a historical phenomenon into an eternal law. This historical phenomenon is the relatively faster development of manufacture, in fact the truly bourgeois branch of industry, as against agriculture. The latter has become more productive, but not in the same ratio as industry. Whereas in manufacture, productivity has increased tenfold, in agriculture it has perhaps doubled. Agriculture has therefore become relatively less productive, although absolutely more productive. This only proves the very queer development of bourgeois production and its inherent contradictions. It does not, however, invalidate the proposition that agriculture becomes relatively less productive, and hence, compared with the value of the industrial product, the value of the agricultural product rises, and with it also rent. That in the course of development of capitalist production, agricultural labor has become relatively less productive than industrial labor only means that the productivity of agriculture has not developed with the same speed and to the same degree. Suppose the relation of industry A to industry B is as 1-to-1. Originally, agriculture was more productive because not only natural forces, but also a machine created by nature play a part in agriculture. Right from the start, the individual worker is working with the machine. Hence, in ancient times and in the Middle Ages, agricultural products were relatively much cheaper than industrial products, which is obvious from the ratio of the two within the average wage. At the same time, let 1-to-1 indicate the fertility of the two branches of production. Now, if industry A rises to 10, i.e. its fertility increases tenfold, while industry B merely increases threefold, becomes 3, then whereas the industries were previously as 1-to-1, they are now as 10-to-3, or as 1-to-3/10. The fertility of industry B has decreased relatively by 7/10, although absolutely it has increased threefold. For the highest rent, it is the same, relatively to industry, as if it had risen because the poorest land had become 7/10 less fertile. Now it does not by any means follow, as Ricardo supposes, that the rate of profit has fallen because wages have risen as a result of the relative increase in the price of agricultural products. For the average wage is not determined by the relative, but by the absolute value of the products which enter into it. It does, however, follow that the rate of profit, really the rate of surplus value, has not risen in the same ratio as the productive power of manufacturing industry, and this is due to agriculture being relatively less productive. This is absolutely certain. The reduction in the necessary labor time seems small compared with the progress in industry. This is evident from the fact that the agricultural products of countries like Russia, etc., can beat those of England. The lower value of money in the wealthier countries, i.e. the low relative production costs of money in the wealthier countries, does not enter into it at all. For the question is, why it does not affect their industrial products in competition with poorer countries when it does affect their agricultural products. Incidentally, this does not prove that poor countries produce more cheaply, that their agricultural labor is more productive. Even in the United States, the volume of corn at a given price has increased, as has recently been proved by statistical information. Not, however, because the yield per acre has risen, but because more acres have come under cultivation. It cannot be said that the land is more productive where there is a great landmass and where large areas, superficially cultivated, yield a greater absolute product with the same amount of labor than much smaller areas in the more advanced country. The fact that less productive land is brought under cultivation does not necessarily prove that agriculture has become less productive. On the contrary, it may prove that it has become more productive, that the inferior land is being cultivated not only because the price of the agricultural product has sufficiently risen to compensate for the capital investment, but also the converse, that the means of production have developed to such an extent that the unproductive land has become productive and capable of yielding not only the normal profit, but also rent. Land which is fertile at a given stage of development of productive power may be unfertile for a lower developmental stage. In agriculture, the extension of labor time, i.e. the augmentation of absolute surplus value, is only possible to a limited degree. One cannot work by gaslight on the land, and so on. True, one can rise early in the spring and summer, but this is offset by the shorter winter days, when, in any case, only a relatively small amount of work can be accomplished. So in this respect, absolute surplus value is greater in industry, so long as the normal working day is not regulated by force of law. A second reason for a smaller amount of surplus value being created in agriculture is the long period during which the product remains in the process of production without any labor being expended on it. With the exception of certain branches of agriculture such as stock raising, sheep farming, etc., where the population is positively ousted from the land, the number of people employed, relatively to the constant capital use, is still far greater, even in the most advanced large-scale agriculture, than in industry, or at least in the dominating branches of industry. Hence, in this respect, Even if, for the above-mentioned reasons, the mass of surplus value is relatively smaller than it would be with the employment of the same number of people in industry, this latter condition is partly offset again by the wage falling below its average level, the rate of profit can be greater than in industry. But if there are, in agriculture, any causes, we only indicate the above, which raise the rate of profit, not temporarily, but on an average as compared with industry, then the mere existence of the landlord would cause this extra profit to consolidate itself and accrue to him, rather than enter into the formation of the general rate of profit. Section 2. The relationship of the rate of profit to the rate of surplus value, the value of agricultural raw material as an element of constant capital in agriculture. In general terms, the question to be answered with Rodbertus is formulated from the following. The general form of capital advanced is this: constant capital, variable capital, machinery, raw materials, and labor power. In general, the two elements of constant capital are the instruments of labor and the subject of labor. The latter is not necessarily a commodity, a product of labor. It may therefore not exist as an element of capital, although it is invariably an element in the labor process. Soil is the husbandman's raw material, the mine that of the miner, the water that of the fisherman, and even the forest that of the hunter. In the most complete form of capital, however, these three elements of the labor process also exist as three elements of capital, i.e. they are all commodities, use values which have an exchange value and are products of labor. In this case, all three elements enter into the process of creating value, although machinery enters into it not to the extent to which it enters into the labor process, but only insofar as it is consumed. The following question now arises. Can the absence of one of these elements in a particular branch of industry enhance the rate of profit, not the rate of surplus value, in that industry? In general terms, the formula itself provides the answer. The rate of profit equals the ratio of surplus value to the total capital advanced. Throughout this investigation, it is assumed that the rate of surplus value, i.e. the division of the value of the product between the capitalist and the worker, remains constant. The rate of surplus value is S over V, surplus over variable capital. The rate of profit is S over C plus V, the surplus over the sum of the constant and the variable capital. Since S prime, the rate of surplus value, is given, V is given, and S over V is assumed to be a constant value. Therefore, the magnitude of S over C plus V can only alter when C plus V changes, and since V, the variable capital, is given, this can only increase or decrease because C decreases or increases. And further, S over C plus V will increase or decrease not in the ratio of C to V, but according to C's relation to the sum of C plus V. If C equals 0, then S over C plus V equals S over V. The rate of profit would, in this case, be equal to the rate of surplus value, and this is its highest possible amount, since no sort of calculation can alter the magnitude of S and V. Suppose that V equals 100 and S equals 50. Then S over V is 50 over 100, or 50%. If a constant capital of 100 were added, then the rate of profit would be 50, being the surplus, over 100 plus 100, i.e. 50 over 200, being 25%. The rate of profit would have decreased by half. If 150C were added to 100V, then the rate of profit would be 50 over 250, i.e. 1/5, or 20%. In the first instance, the total capital equals V, i.e. equals variable capital, hence the rate of profit equals the rate of surplus value. In the second instance, total capital equals 2 times V, hence the rate of profit is only half of the rate of surplus value. In the third instance, the total capital is 2.5 times 100, that is, 2 1/2 times V. V is now only 2/5 of the total capital. Surplus value equals half of V, i.e. half of 100, hence is only half of 2/5 of the total capital, or 2/10 of the total capital, being 20%. Hence, to start with, this much has been established. Provided V remains constant, and S over V2, then it is of no consequence how C is composed. If C has a certain magnitude, say 100, then it makes no difference whether it consists of 50 units of raw material and 50 of machinery, or 10 of raw material and 90 of machinery, or no raw material and 100 machinery, or any way around. For the rate of profit is determined by the relationship S over C plus V. The relative value of the various production elements contained in C is of no consequence here. For instance, in the production of coal, the raw materials, after deducting coal itself, which is used as an auxiliary material, may be reckoned as 0, and the entire constant capital can be assumed to consist of machinery, including buildings and tools. On the other hand, With a tailor, machinery can be considered as zero, and here the whole constant capital resolves into raw materials, particularly where tailors running a large business do not as yet use sewing machines, and on the other hand even save buildings, as sometimes occurs nowadays in London, by employing their workers as outworkers. This is a new phenomenon, where the second division of labor reappears in the form of the first. If the colliery owner employs 1,000 units of machinery and 1,000 units of labor, and the tailor 1,000 of raw materials and 1,000 of labor, then with an equal rate of surplus value, the rate of profit in both instances is also the same. If we assume that surplus value is 20%, then the rate of profit would in both cases be 10%, namely 200 over 2,000, i.e. 2 over 20, or 10%. Hence, there are only two instances in which the ratio between the component parts of C, i.e. raw materials and machinery, can affect the rate of profit. One, if a change in this ratio modifies the absolute magnitude of C, or two, if the ratio between the component parts of C modifies the size of the variable capital. This would imply organic changes in production itself, and not merely the tautologist statement that if a particular part of C accounts for a smaller portion, then the other must make up a larger portion of the total amount. In the real bill of an English farmer, wages amount to £1,690, manure to £686, seeds to £150, fodder for cows to £100. Thus, raw material comes to £936, which is more than half the amount spent on wages. Quote, in Flanders, dung and hay are in these parts imported from Holland for flax growing, etc. In turn, they export flax, linseed, etc. The refuse of the towns has therefore become a matter of trade, and is regularly sold at high prices to Belgium. At about 20 miles from Antwerp, up the Schelde, the reservoirs may be seen for the manure that is brought from Holland. The trade is managed by a company of capitalists in the Dutch boats, etc. And so even manure, plain muck, has become merchandise, not to speak of bone meal, guano, etc. That the elements of production are estimated in terms of money is not merely due to the formal change in production. New materials are introduced into the soil, and its old ones are sold for reasons of production. This is not merely a formal difference between the capitalist and the previous mode of production. The seed trade has risen in importance to the extent to which the importance of seed rotation has become recognized. Hence, it would be ridiculous to say that no raw material, i.e. raw material as a commodity, enters into agriculture, whether it be reproduced by agriculture itself or bought as a commodity acquired from outside. It would be equally absurd to say that the machine employed by the engineer who constructs machines does not figure as an element of value in his capital. A German peasant who year after year produces his own elements of production, seeds, manure, etc., and with his family consumes part of his crops, needs to spend money, as far as production itself is concerned, only on the purchase of a few tools for cultivating the land, and on wages. Let us assume that the value of all his expenses is 100, half of this having to be paid out in money. He consumes half of the product in kind. Production costs are also included here. The other half he sells, and he receives, say, 100. His gross income is thus 100, and if he relates this to his capital of 50, then it amounts to 100% profit. If 1/3 of the 50 is deducted for rent and 1/3 for taxes, being 33 1/3 in all, then he retains 16 2/3. Calculated on 50, this is 33 1/3%. But in fact, he has only received 16 2/3% of the 100 he laid out originally. The peasant has merely miscalculated and has cheated himself. The capitalist farmer does not make such errors. Christophe Mathieu de Dombasle says in his Agricultural Annals that under the smallholding contract, in the province of Berry for example, quote, the landlord supplies the land, the buildings, and usually all or part of the livestock and the tools required for cultivation. The tenant, for his part, supplies his labor and nothing, or almost nothing else. The products of the land are shared in equal parts. The tenants are, as a rule, submerged in dire poverty. If the smallholder, having laid out 1,000 francs, increases his gross product by 1,500 francs, he must pass half of it on to the landowner, retaining merely 750, and so loses 250 francs of his expenses. Under the previous system of cultivation, the expenses or costs of production were almost exclusively drawn in kind, from the products themselves, for the consumption of the animals and of the cultivator of the land and his family. Hardly any cash was paid out. Only these particular circumstances could give rise to the belief that the landowner and tenant could divide amongst themselves the whole of the harvest, which had not been consumed during production. But this process is only applicable to this type of agriculture, namely low-level agriculture. But when it is desired to raise that level, it is realized that this is only possible by making certain advances which have to be deducted from the gross product in order to be able to utilize them again in the following year. Hence, this kind of division of the gross product becomes an insurmountable obstacle to any sort of improvement. Section 3. Value and average price in agriculture. Absolute rent. Subsection A. Equalization of the rate of profit in industry. Rodbertus seems to think that competition brings about an average rate of profit by reducing the commodities to their real value, i.e. that it regulates their price relationships in such a manner that the correlative quantities of labor time contained in the various commodities are expressed in money or whatever else happens to be the measure of value. This is of course not brought about by the price of a commodity at any given moment being equal to its value, nor does it have to be equal to its value. According to Rodbertus, this is what happens. For example, the price of commodity A rises above its value and for a time remains moreover at this high level, or even continues to rise. The profit of the capitalist who produces A thus rises above the average profit, in that he appropriates not only his own unpaid labor time, but also a part of the unpaid labor time which the other capitalists have quote-unquote produced. This has to be compensated by a fall in profit in one or other sphere of production, provided the price of the other commodities in terms of money remains constant. If the commodity is a means of subsistence generally consumed by the worker, then it will depress the rate of profit in all other branches. If it enters as a constituent part into the constant capital, then it will force down the rate of profit in all those spheres of production where it forms an element in the constant capital. Finally, the commodity may neither be an element in any constant capital, nor form a necessary item in the worker's means of subsistence. For those commodities which the worker can choose to buy or abstain from buying, he consumes as a consumer in general, and not as a worker. But it may be one of the consumer goods, an article for individual consumption in general. If, as such, it is consumed by the industrial capitalist himself, then the rise in its price in no way affects the amount of surplus value or the rate of surplus value. Now, if the capitalist wanted to maintain his previous standard of consumption, then that part of profit, i.e. surplus value, which he uses for individual consumption, would rise in relation to that which he sinks into industrial reproduction. The latter would decrease. As a result of the price rise, or rise in profit above its average rate, in A, the volume of profit in B, C, etc. would diminish within a certain space of time, which is also determined by reproduction. If Article A was exclusively consumed by other than industrial capitalists, then they would consume more than before of commodity A as compared with commodities B, C, etc. The demand for commodities B, C, etc. would fall, their price would fall, and in this case, the price rise in A, or the rise in profit in A above the average rate, would have brought about a fall in the profit of B, C, etc., below the average rate, by forcing down the money prices of their commodities, in contrast to the previous instances where the money price of B, C, etc. remained constant. Capitals would migrate from B, C, etc., where the rate of profit is sunk below the average level, to A's sphere of production. This would apply particularly to a portion of the new capital which is continually entering the market, and which would naturally tend to penetrate into the more profitable sphere, A. Consequently, after some time, the price of Article A would fall below its value, and would continue to do so for a longer or shorter period, until the reverse movement set in again. The opposite process would have taken place in spheres B, C, etc., partly as a result of the reduced supplies of articles B, C, etc., because of the exodus of capital, i.e. because of the organic changes taking place in these spheres of production themselves, and partly as a result of the changes which have occurred in A, and which in turn are affecting B, C, etc. in the opposite direction. Incidentally, it may well be that in this process, assuming the value of money to be constant, the money prices of B, C, etc. never regain their original level, although they may rise above the value of commodities B, C, etc., and hence the rate of profit in B, C, etc. may also rise above the general rate of profit. Improvements, inventions, greater economy and means of production, etc. are introduced not at times when prices rise above their average level, but when they fall below it, i.e. when profit falls below its normal rate. Hence, during the period of falling prices of B and C, their real value may fall. In other words, the minimum labor time required for the production of these commodities may decrease. In this case, the commodity can only regain its former money price if the rise in its price over its value equals the margin, i.e. the difference between the price which expresses its new value and the price which expressed its former higher value. Here, the price of the commodity would have changed the value of the commodity by affecting supply and the cost of production. The result of the above-mentioned movement is this. If we take the average of the increases and decreases in the price of commodity above or below its value, or the period of equalization of rises and falls, periods which are constantly repeated, then the average price is equal to the value of the commodity. The average profit in a particular sphere is therefore also equal to the general rate of profit. For although, in this sphere, profit rose above or fell below its old rate with the rise or fall in prices, or with the increase and decrease in the cost of production while the price remained constant, on an average, over the period, the commodity was sold at its value. Hence, the profit yielded is equal to the general rate of profit. This is Adam Smith's conception, and even more so Ricardo's, since the latter adheres more firmly to the real concept of value. Rodbertus acquires it from them, and yet this conception is wrong. What is the effect of the competition between capitals? The average price of the commodities during a period of equalization is such that these prices yield the same profits to the producers of commodities in every sphere, for instance 10%. What else does this mean? That the price of each commodity stands at 1/10 above the price of production costs, which the capitalist has incurred, i.e. the amount he has spent in order to produce the commodity. In general terms, this just means that capitals of equal size yield equal profits, that the price of each commodity is 1/10 higher than the price of the capital advanced, consumed, or represented in the commodity. It is, however, quite incorrect to say that capitals in the various spheres of production produce the same surplus value in relation to their size, even if we assume that the absolute working day is equally long in all spheres, i.e. if we assume a set rate of surplus value. We leave aside here the possibility of one capitalist enforcing longer working hours than another, and we assume a fixed absolute working day for all spheres. The variation in absolute working days is partly offset by the varying intensity of labor, etc., and partly these differences only signify arbitrary excess profits, exceptional cases, etc. Bearing in mind the above assumption, the amount of surplus value produced by capitals of equal size varies firstly according to the correlation of their organic components, i.e. of variable and constant capital. Secondly, according to their period of circulation, insofar as this is determined by the ratio of fixed capital to circulating capital, and also by various periods of reproduction of the different sorts of fixed capital. Thirdly, according to the duration of the actual period of production, as distinct from the duration of labor time itself, which again may lead to substantial differences between the length of the production period and circulation period. The first of these correlations, namely that between constant and variable capital, can itself spring from a great divergency of causes. It may, for example, be purely formal, so that the raw material worked up in one sphere is dearer than that worked up in another, or it may result from the varying productivity of labor, etc. Thus, if the commodities were sold at their values, or if the average prices of the commodities were equal to their values, then the rate of profit in the various spheres would have to vary a great deal. In one case, it would be 50, in others 40, 30, 20, 10, etc. Taking the total volume of commodities for a year in Sphere A, for instance, their value would be equal to the capital advanced in them plus the unremunerated labor they contain. Ditto in Spheres B and C. But since A, B, and C contain different amounts of unpaid labor, for instance A more than B and B more than C, the commodities A might perhaps yield 3S, S being surplus value, to their producers, B at 2S and C S. Since the rate of profit is determined by the ratio of surplus value to the total capital advanced, and as on our assumption, this is the same in A, B, C, etc., then if we denote C as the capital advanced, the various rates of profit will be 3S over C, 2S over C, and S over C. Competition of capitals can therefore only equalize the rates of profit, for instance in our example, by making the rates of profit equal to 2S over C, 2S over C, and 2S over C in the spheres A, B, and C. A would sell his commodity at 1S less and C at 1S more than its value. The average price in Sphere A would be below, and in Sphere C above, the value of the commodities A and C. As the example of B shows, it can in fact happen that the average price and the value of a commodity coincide. This occurs when the surplus value created in Sphere B itself equals the average profit. In other words, when the relationship of the various components of the capital in Sphere B is the same as that which exists when the total sum of capitals, the capital of the capitalist class, is regarded as one magnitude on which the whole of surplus value is calculated, irrespective of the sphere in which it has been created. In this aggregate capital, the periods of turnover, etc., are equalized. One can, for instance, consider that the whole of this capital is turned over during 1 year. In that case, every section of the aggregate capital would, in accordance with its magnitude, participate in the aggregate surplus value and draw a corresponding part of it. And since every individual capital is to be regarded as a shareholder in this aggregate capital, it would be correct to say, first, that its rate of profit is the same as all the others because capitals of the same size yield the same amount of profit. Secondly, and this arises automatically from the first point, that the volume of profit depends on the size of the capital, on the number of shares the capitalist owns in that aggregate capital. Competition among capitals thus seeks to treat every capital as a share of the aggregate, and correspondingly to regulate its participation in surplus value, and hence also in profit. Competition more or less succeeds in this by means of its equalizations. We shall not examine here the reason why it encounters particular obstacles in certain spheres. But in plain language, this just means that the capitalists strive, and this striving is competition, to divide among themselves the quantity of unpaid labor, or the products of this quantity of unpaid labor, which they squeeze out of the working class, not according to the surplus labor produced directly by a particular capital, but corresponding firstly to the relative portion of the aggregate capital which a particular capital represents, and secondly, according to the amount of surplus labor produced by the aggregate capital. The capitalists, like hostile brothers, divide among themselves the loot of other people's labor which they have appropriated, so that on an average, one receives the same amount of unpaid labor as another. Competition achieves this equalization by regulating average prices. These average prices themselves, however, are either above or below the value of the commodity, so that no commodity yields a higher rate of profit than any other. It is therefore wrong to say that competition among capitals brings about a general rate of profit by equalizing the prices of commodities to their values. On the contrary, it does so by converting the values of the commodities into average prices, in which a part of surplus value is transferred from one commodity to another, etc. The value of a commodity equals the quantity of paid and unpaid labor contained in it. The average price of a commodity equals the quantity of paid labor it contains, materialized or living, plus an average quota of unpaid labor. This latter does not depend on whether this amount was contained in the commodity itself, or on whether more or less of it was embodied in the value of the commodity. Subsection B. Formulation of the problem of rent. I leave this over for a later inquiry which does not belong to the subject matter of this book. It is possible that certain spheres of production function under circumstances which work against a reduction in their values to average prices in the above sense, and do not permit competition to achieve this victory. If this were the case, for instance with agricultural rent, or rent from mines, there are rents which are altogether only explicable by monopoly conditions, for instance the water rent in Lombardy and in parts of Asia, also house rent insofar as it represents rent from landed property, then it would follow that while the product of all industrial capitals is raised or lowered to the average price, the product of agriculture would equal its value, which would be above the average price. Might there be obstacles here which cause more of the surplus value created in this sphere of production to be appropriated as property of the sphere itself than should be the case according to the laws of competition, more than it should receive according to the quota of capital invested in this branch of industry? Supposing capitals which are producing 10 or 20 or 30% more surplus value than industrial capitals of equal size in other spheres of production, not just temporarily, but because of the very nature of their spheres of production, as opposed to the others. Supposing, I say, they were able to hang on to this excess surplus value in the face of competition, and to prevent it from being included in the general accounts or distribution which determine the general rate of profit, then, in this case, one could distinguish between two recipients in the spheres of production of these capitals, the one who would get the general rate of profit, and the other who would get the surplus exclusively inherent in his sphere. Every capitalist could hand over this excess to the privileged one in order to invest his capital here, and he would retain for himself the general rate of profit, like every other capitalist, working under the same conditions. If this were the case in agriculture, etc., then the splitting of the surplus value into profit and rent would by no means indicate that labor as such is actually more productive, in the sense of production of surplus value, here than in manufacture. Hence, it would not be necessary to ascribe any magic powers to the soil. This, moreover, is in any case absurd, since value equals labor, therefore surplus value cannot possibly equal soil. Although relative surplus value may be due to the natural fertility of the soil, but under no circumstances could this result in a higher price for the products of the soil. Rather the opposite. Nor would it be necessary to have recourse to Ricardo's theory, which is disagreeably linked with the Malthusian trash, has repulsive consequences, and though in theory it is not especially opposed to my views on relative surplus value, it deprives them of much of their practical significance. Ricardo's point is this. Rent, for instance in agriculture, can be nothing other than an excess above general profit, where, as he presupposes, agriculture is run on capitalist lines, where there is a farmer. Whether that which the landlord receives is actually equal to this rent in the bourgeois economic sense is quite irrelevant. It may be purely a deduction from wages, see Ireland, or it may be partly derived from the reduction of the farmer's profit below the average level of profits. Which of these possible factors happens to be operative is of no consequence whatsoever. Rent in the bourgeois system only exists as a special, characteristic form of surplus value insofar as it is an excess over and above general profit. But how is this possible? The commodity wheat, like every other commodity, is, according to Ricardo, sold at its value, i.e. it is exchanged for other commodities in relation to the labor time embodied in it. This is the first erroneous assumption, which complicates the problem by posing it artificially. Only in exceptional circumstances are commodities exchanged at their value. Their average prices are determined in a different way, see above. The farmer who grows wheat makes the same profit as all the other capitalists. This proves that, like all the others, he appropriates that portion of labor time for which he has not paid his workers. Where, on top of this, does the rent come from? It must represent labor time. Why should surplus labor in agriculture resolve itself into profit and rent, while in industry it is just profit? And how is this possible at all if the profit in agriculture equals the profit in every other sphere of production? Ricardo's faulty conception of profit and the way in which he confuses it with surplus value have also a detrimental effect here. They make the whole thing more difficult for him. Ricardo solves this difficulty by assuming that in principle it is non-existent. This indeed is in principle the only possibility of overcoming any difficulty, but there are two ways of doing this. Either one shows that the contradiction to the principle is an illusion which arises from the development of the thing itself, or one denies the existence of the difficulty at one point, as Ricardo does, and then takes this as a starting point from which one can proceed to explain its existence at some other stage. He assumes a point at which the farmer's capital, like everyone else's, only yields profit. This capital may be invested in a non-rent-paying or individual farm, or in a non-rent-paying part of the land of a farm. In fact, it can be any capital which is employed in the cultivation of land that does not pay rent. This, moreover, is the starting point, and it can also be expressed as follows. Originally, the farmer's capital only pays profit, no rent. It is no different from any other industrial capital. Rent only enters into it because the demand for grain rises, and now, in contrast to other branches of industry, it becomes necessary to resort to less fertile ground. The farmer, the supposed original farmer, suffers, like any other industrial capitalist, insofar as he has to pay his workers more because of the rise in the price of food. But he gains because of the rise in the price of his commodity above its value. Firstly, to the extent to which the value of other commodities which enter into his constant capital falls relatively to his commodity, and so he buys them more cheaply, and secondly, insofar as he owns the surplus value in the form of his dearer commodity. Thus, this farmer's profit rises above the average rate of profit, which has, however, fallen. Since another capitalist moves onto the less fertile land, number 2, which, with this lower rate of profit, can supply produce at the price of number 1, or perhaps even a little more cheaply. Be that as it may, we now have, once more, the normal situation on number 2, that surplus value merely resolves itself into profit. But we have explained the rent for number 1 by the existence of a twofold price of production, the production price of number 2, which is simultaneously the market price of number 1. A temporary surplus gain has been achieved, just as with the factory-made commodity which is produced under more favorable conditions. The price of corn, which in addition to profit comprises rent, in fact consists only of materialized labor, and is equal to its value. It is, however, equal not to the value embodied in itself, but to the value of number 2. It is impossible to have two market prices side by side. While Ricardo introduces farmer number 2 because of the fall in the rate of profit, Sterling introduces him because wages have fallen, not risen, following upon the price of corn. This fall in wages allows number 2 to cultivate a piece of land, number 2, at the old rate of profit, although the soil is less fertile. Once the existence of rent has been established in this way, the rest follows easily. The difference between rents according to varying fertility, etc., of course remains correct. This does not necessarily imply that less and less fertile land has to come under cultivation. So here we have Ricardo's theory. The higher price of corn, which yields an excess profit to number 1, does not yield even as much as the earlier rate of profit for number 2. It is thus clear that product number 2 contains more value than product number 1, i.e. it is the product of more labor time. It embodies a greater quantity of labor. Therefore, more labor time must be supplied to manufacture the same product, say for instance a quarter of wheat, and the rise in rent will be relative to this decreasing fertility of the land, or the growth in the quantity of labor which must be employed to produce, say, a quarter of wheat. Of course, Ricardo would not talk of a rise in rent if there were just an increase in the number of quarters from which rent is paid, but only if the price of the individual quarter rose from, say, 30 shillings to 60 shillings. True, he does sometimes forget that the absolute volume of rent can grow with a reduced rate of rent, just as the absolute amount of profit can increase with a decreasing rate of profit. Others seek to bypass this difficulty by directly denying its existence. See Carey, for instance. Rent, they say, is only interest on the capital which at an earlier stage was incorporated into the land. Therefore, again, only a form of profit. Here, then, the very existence of rent is denied, and so, indeed, explained away. Others, for instance, see Buchanan, regard it just as a consequence of monopoly. See also Hopkins. With them, it is merely a surcharge above the value. For Mr. Opdyke, a typical Yankee, landed property or rent becomes the legalized reflection of the capital. With Ricardo, the examination is rendered more difficult by the two false assumptions. Ricardo, it is true, was not the inventor of the theory of rent. West and Malthus had put it into print before him. The source, however, is Anderson. But what distinguished Ricardo is the way in which he links rent with his theory of value, although West did not entirely miss the real interconnection either. As his later polemic about rent with Ricardo shows, Malthus himself did not understand the theory he had adopted from Anderson. If we start from the correct principle that the value of commodities is determined by the labor time necessary for their production, and that value in general is nothing other than materialized social labor time, then it follows that the average price of commodities is determined by the labor time required for their production. This conclusion would be the right one if it had been proved that average price equals value. But I show that just because the value of the commodity is determined by labor time, the average price of the commodities, except in the unique case in which the so-called individual rate of profit in a particular sphere of production, i.e. the profit determined by the surplus value yielded in this sphere itself, is equal to the average rate of profit on the total capital, this can never be equal to their value, although this determination of the average price is only derived from the value which is based on labor time. In the first place, then, it follows that even commodities whose average price, if we disregard the value of the constant capital, resolves only into wages and profit, in such a way that these stand at their normal rate, i.e. are average wages and average profit, even those commodities can be sold above or below their value. The fact that the commodity yields rent on top of profit does not prove that the commodity is sold above its intrinsic value, any more than the circumstance of the surplus value of a commodity only expressing itself in the category of normal profit proves that the commodity is sold at its value. If a commodity can yield an average rate of profit, or the general rate of profit on capital, which is below its own rate of profit determined by its real surplus value, then it follows that if on top of this average rate of profit, commodities in a particular sphere of production yield a second amount of surplus value, which carries a separate name, for instance rent, then the sum of profit plus rent need not be higher than the surplus value contained in that commodity. Since profit can be less than the intrinsic surplus value of the commodity, or the quantity of unpaid labor it embodies, profit plus rent need not be larger than the intrinsic surplus value of this commodity. Why this occurs in a particular sphere of production, as opposed to other spheres, has of course still to be explained. But the problem has been simplified. This commodity, the commodity yielding rent, differs from the others in the following way. In a number of these other commodities, average price is above their intrinsic value, but only in order to raise their rate of profit to the level of the general rate. In another section of these other commodities, the average price stands at a level below their intrinsic value, but only to the extent required to reduce their rate of profit to concur with the general rate. Finally, in a third section of these other commodities, if sold at their intrinsic value, they yield the general rate of profit. But the commodity which yields rent differs from all these three instances. Whatever the circumstances, it is sold at a price which will yield more than average profit, as determined by the general rate of profit on capital. Now the question arises, which or how many of these three instances can occur? Suppose that the whole of the surplus value the commodity contains is realized in its price. In that case, it excludes the third instance, namely those commodities whose entire surplus value is realized in their average price, because they only yield ordinary profit. We may therefore dismiss this one. Similarly, on this presupposition, we can exclude the first instance, where the surplus value realized in the price of the commodity is above its intrinsic surplus value. For it is assumed that the surplus value contained in it is realized in its price. This instance is thus analogous with case 2 of those commodities whose intrinsic surplus value is higher than the surplus value realized in their average price. As with these commodities, the profit represents a form of this surplus value, in this case profit on the capital employed, which has been reduced to the level of the general rate of profit. The excess intrinsic surplus value of the commodity over and above this profit is, however, in contrast to commodity number 2, also realized in these exceptional commodities, but accrues not to the owner of the capital, but to the owner of the land, the natural agent, the mine, etc. Or, what happens if we assume that the price is forced up to such a degree that it carries more than the average rate of profit? This is, for instance, the case with actual monopoly prices. This assumption, applied to every sphere of production where capital and labor may be freely employed, and whose production, so far as the volume of capital employed is concerned, is subject to the general laws, would not only be begging the question, but would directly contradict the foundations of economic science and of capitalist production, the former being merely the theoretical expression of the latter. For such an assumption presupposes the very phenomenon which is to be explained, namely, that in a particular sphere of production, the price of a commodity must carry more than the general rate of profit, more than the average rate of profit, and to this end must be sold above its value. It presupposes that agricultural products are excluded from the general laws of value of commodities and of capitalist production. It moreover presupposes this because the peculiar presence of rent side by side with profit at first glance makes it appear so. Hence, this is absurd. So there is nothing left but to assume that special circumstances exist in this particular sphere of production, which influence the situation and cause the prices of the commodities to realize the whole of their intrinsic surplus value. This in contrast to case number 2 of the other commodities, where only as much of their intrinsic surplus value is realized by their prices as is yielded by the general rate of profit, where their average prices fall so far below their surplus value that they only yield the general rate of profit. Or in other words, their average profit is no greater than the average profit in all other spheres of production of capital. In this way, the problem has already become much simpler. It is no longer a question of explaining how it comes about that the price of a commodity yields rent as well as profit, thus apparently evading the general law of value, and by raising its price above its intrinsic surplus value, carrying more than the general rate of profit for a given capital. The question is why, in the process of equalization of commodities at average prices, this particular commodity does not have to pass on to other commodities so much of its intrinsic surplus value that it only yields the average profit, but is able to realize a portion of its own surplus value which forms an excess over and above the average profit, so that it is possible for a farmer who invests capital in this sphere of production to sell the commodity at prices which yield him the ordinary profit and at the same time enable him to pay the excess in surplus value realized over and above this profit to a third person, that is, the landlord. Put in this way, the very formulation of the problem carries its own solution. Subsection C. Private ownership of the land as a necessary condition for the existence of absolute rent. Surplus value in agriculture resolves into profit and rent. It is quite simply the private ownership of land, mines, water, etc. by certain people which enables them to snatch, intercept, and seize the excess surplus value over and above profit, meaning average profit, the rate of profit determined by the general rate of profit, contained in the commodities of these particular spheres of production, these particular fields of capital investment, and so to prevent it from entering into the general process by which the general rate of profit is formed. Moreover, some of this surplus value is actually collected in every industrial enterprise, since rent for the land used by factory buildings, workhouses, etc. figures in every instance, for even where the land is available free, no factories are built, except in the more or less populated areas with good means of communication. Supposing the commodities produced by the poorest cultivated land belong to Category 3, i.e. those commodities whose average price equals their value. In other words, the whole of their inherent surplus value is realized in their price because only thus do they yield the ordinary profit. In this case, the land would pay no rent, and land ownership would be purely nominal. If a payment were made for the use of the land, then it would only prove that the small capitalists, as is partly the case in England, see Newman, are satisfied with making a profit below the average. The same applies whenever the rate of rent is higher than the difference between the inherent surplus value of a commodity and the average profit. There is even land whose cultivation at most suffices to pay wages, for although here the laborer works for himself the whole of his working day, his labor time is longer than the socially necessary labor time. It is so unproductive, relative to the generally prevailing productivity in this branch of work, that although the man works for himself for 12 hours, he hardly produces as much as a worker under more favorable conditions of production does in 8 hours. This is the same relationship as that of the hand loom weaver who competes with the power loom. Although the product of this hand loom weaver was equal to 12 hours of labor, it was only equal to 8 or even fewer hours of socially necessary labor, and his product therefore only had the value of 8 necessary labor hours. If, in such an instance, the cottager pays a rent, then this is purely a deduction from his necessary wage, and does not represent surplus value, let alone an excess over and above average profit. Assume that in a country like the United States, the number of competing farmers is as yet so small, and the appropriation of land so much just a matter of form, that everyone has had the opportunity to invest his capital in land in the cultivation of the soil, without the permission of hitherto existing owners, cultivators, or farmers. In these circumstances, it is possible, over a considerable period, with the exception of that landed property which, by its very situation in populated areas, carries a monopoly, that the surplus value which the farmer produces on top of the average profit is not realized in the price of his product, but that he may have to share it with his brother capitalists in the same way as this is done with the surplus value of all commodities which would give an excess profit, i.e. raise the rate of profit above the general rate if their surplus value were realized in their price. In this case, the general rate of profit would rise, because wheat, etc., like other manufactured commodities, would be sold below its value. This selling below its value would not constitute an exception, but rather would prevent wheat from forming an exception to other commodities in the same category. Secondly, assume that in a given country, the land is all of a particular quality, so that if the whole of the surplus value from the commodity were realized in its price, it would yield the usual profit on capital. In this case, no rent would be paid. The absence of rent would in no way affect the general rate of profit. It would neither raise it nor lower it, just as it is not influenced by the fact that other non-agricultural products are to be found in this category. Since the commodities belong to this category just because their inherent surplus value equals the average profit, they cannot alter the level of this profit. On the contrary, they conform with it and do not influence it at all, although it influences them. Thirdly, assume that all the land consists of a particular type of soil, but this is so poor that the capital employed in it is so unproductive that its product belongs to that kind of commodity whose surplus value lies below average profit. Since wages would rise everywhere as a result of the unproductiveness of agriculture, surplus value could in this case, of course, only be higher where absolute labor time can be prolonged, where the raw material, such as iron, etc., is not the product of agriculture, or further, where it is like cotton, silk, etc., an imported article and a product of more fertile soil. In this case, the price of the agricultural commodity would include a surplus value higher than that inherent in it, to enable it to yield the usual profit. The general rate of profit would consequently fall, despite the absence of rent. Or assume in case number 2 that the soil is very unproductive. Then surplus value of this agricultural product, by its very equality with average profit, would show that the latter is altogether low, since in agriculture, perhaps 11 of the 12 working hours are required to produce just the wages, and the surplus value only equals 1 hour or less. These various examples illustrate the following. In the first case, the absence or lack of rent is bound up with or concurs with an increased rate of profit, as compared with other countries where rent has developed. In the second case, the lack or absence of rent does not affect the rate of profit at all. And in the third case, compared with other countries where rent exists, it is bound up with and indicative of a relatively low, general rate of profit. It follows from this that the development of a particular rent in itself has nothing to do with the productivity of agricultural labor, since the absence or lack of rent can be associated with a rising, falling, or constant rate of profit. The question here is not, why is the excess surplus value above the average profit retained in agriculture, etc.? On the contrary, we should rather ask, why should the opposite take place here? Surplus value is nothing other than unpaid labor, The average or normal profit is nothing other than the quantity of unpaid labor which each capital of a given magnitude of value is supposed to realize. If we say that average profit is 10%, then this means nothing other than that a capital of 100 units commands 10 units of unpaid labor, or 100 units of materialized labor command a tenth of their amount in unpaid labor. Thus, excess of surplus value over average profit implies that a commodity, its price, or that part of its price which consists of surplus value, contains a quantity of unpaid labor which is greater than the quantity of unpaid labor that forms the average profit, which therefore, in the average price of the commodities, forms the excess of their price over their costs of production. In each individual commodity, the costs of production represent the capital advanced, and the excess over these production costs represents the unpaid labor which the advanced capital commands. Hence, the relationship of this excess in price over the cost of production shows the rate at which a given capital, employed in the production process of commodities, commands unpaid labor, irrespective of whether the unpaid labor contained in the commodity of the particular sphere of production is equal to this rate or not. Now, what forces the individual capitalist to sell his commodity at an average price which yields him only the average profit and makes him realize less unpaid labor than is in fact worked into his own commodity? This average price is thrust upon him. It is by no means the result of his own free will. He would prefer to sell the commodity above its value. It is forced upon him by the competition of other capitals. For every capital of the same size could also be rushed into A, the branch of production in which the relationship of unpaid labor to the invested capital, for instance £100, is greater than in production spheres B, C, etc., whose products also satisfy a social need just as much as the commodities of production sphere A. When there are spheres of production in which certain natural conditions of production, such as, for example, arable land, coal seams, iron mines, waterfalls, etc., without which the production process cannot be carried out, without which commodities cannot be produced in this sphere, when there are spheres of production in which these natural conditions are in the hands of others than the proprietors or owners of the materialized labor, the capitalists, then this second type of proprietor of the conditions of production will say, if I let you have this condition of production for your use, then you will make your average profit. You will appropriate the normal quantity of unpaid labor. But your production yields an excess of surplus value of unpaid labor above the rate of profit. This excess you will not throw into the common account, as is usual with you, but I am going to appropriate it myself. It belongs to me. This transaction should suit you, because your capital yields you just the same in this sphere of production as in any other, and besides, this is a very solid branch of production. Apart from the 10% unpaid labor which constitutes the average profit, your capital will also provide a further 20% of additional unpaid labor here. This you will pay over to me, and in order to do so you add 20% unpaid labor to the price of the commodity, and this you simply do not account for with the other capitalists. Just as your ownership of one condition of production, that is materialized labor, enables you to appropriate a certain quantity of unpaid labor from the workers, so my ownership of the other condition of production, the land, etc., enables me to intercept and divert away from you in the entire capitalist class that part of unpaid labor which is excessive to your average profit. Your law will have it that under normal circumstances, capitals of equal size appropriate equal quantities of unpaid labor, and you capitalists can force each other into this position by competition among yourselves. Well, I happen to be applying this law to you. You are not to appropriate any more of the unpaid labor of your workers than you could with the same capital in any other sphere of production, but the law has nothing to do with the excess of unpaid labor which you have produced over the normal quota. Who is going to prevent me from appropriating this excess? Why should I act according to your custom and throw it into the common pot of capital to be shared out among the capitalist class, so that everyone should draw out a part of it in accordance with his share in the aggregate capital? I am not a capitalist. The condition of production which I allow you to utilize is not materialized labor, but a natural phenomenon. Can you manufacture land or water, or mines or coal pits? Certainly not. The means of compulsion, which can be applied to you in order to make you release again a part of the surplus labor you have managed to get hold of, does not exist for me. So out with it. The only thing your brother capitalist can do is compete against you, not against me. If you pay me less excess profit than the difference between the surplus time you have made and the quota of surplus labor due to you according to the rule of capital, your brother capitalists will appear on the scene, and by their competition will force you to pay me fairly, the full amount I have the power to squeeze out of you. The following problems should now be set forth. 1. The transition from feudal land ownership to a different form, commercial land rent, regulated by capitalist production, or, on the other hand, the conversion of this feudal landed property into free peasant property. 2. How rent comes into existence in countries such as the United States, where originally land has not been appropriated, and where, at any rate, in a formal sense, the bourgeois mode of production prevails from the beginning. And 3. The Asiatic forms of land ownership still in existence. But all this does not belong here. According to this theory, then, the private ownership of objects of nature, such as land, water, mines, etc., the ownership of these conditions of production, this essential ingredient of production emanating from nature, is not a source from which flows value, since value is only materialized labor. Neither is it the source from which excess surplus value flows, i.e. an excess of unpaid labor over and above the unpaid labor contained in profit. This ownership is, however, a source of revenue. It is a claim, a means which in the sphere of production that the property enters as a condition of production enables the owner to appropriate that part of the unpaid labor squeezed out by the capitalist, which would otherwise be tossed into the general capital fund as excess over normal profit. This ownership is a means of obstructing the process which takes place in the rest of the capitalist spheres of production, and of holding on to the surplus value created in this particular sphere, so that it is divided between the capitalist and the landowner in that sphere of production itself. In this way, landed property, like capital, constitutes a claim to unpaid labor, gratis labor. And just as with capital, the worker's materialized labor appears as a power over him, so with landed property, the circumstance which enables the landowners to take part of the unpaid labor away from the capitalists makes land ownership appear as a source of value. This then explains the existence of modern ground rent. With a given capital investment, the variation in the amount of rent is only to be explained by the varying fertility of the land. The variation in the amount of rent, given equal fertility, can only be explained by the varying amount of capital invested. In the first case, rent rises because its rate increases in proportion to the capital employed, also according to the area of the land. In the second case, it rises because with the same, or even with a different rate, if the second dose of capital is not equally productive, the amount of rent increases. For this theory, it is immaterial whether the least fertile land yields a rent or not. Further, it is by no means necessary for the fertility of agriculture to decline, although the diversity in productivity, if not artificially overcome, which is possible, is much greater than in similar spheres of industrial production. When we speak of greater or lesser fertility, we are still concerned with the same product. The relationship of the various products one to another is another question. Rent as calculated on the land itself is the rental, the amount of rent. It can rise without an increase in the rate of rent. If the value of money remains unchanged, then the relative value of agricultural products can rise, not because agriculture is becoming less productive, but because, although its productivity is rising, it is rising slower than in industry. On the other hand, a rise in the money price of agricultural products, while the value of money remains the same, is only possible if their value rises, i.e. if agriculture becomes less productive, provided it is not caused by temporary pressure of demand upon supply, as with other commodities. In the cotton industry, the price of the raw material fell continuously with the development of the industry itself. The same applies to iron, coal, etc. The growth of rent here was possible not because its rate rose, but only because more capital was employed. Ricardo is of the following opinion. The powers of nature, such as air, light, electricity, steam, water, are gratis. The land is not, because it is limited. So already, for this reason alone, agriculture is less productive than other industries. If the land were just as common, unappropriated, available in any quantities as the other elements and powers of nature, then it would be much more productive. In the first place, if the land were so easily available, at everyone's free disposal, then a principal element for the formation of capital would be missing. A most important condition of production, and apart from man himself and his labor, the only original condition of production could not be disposed of, could not be appropriated. It could not thus confront the worker as someone else's property and make him into a wage laborer. The productivity of labor in Ricardo's sense, i.e. in the capitalist sense, the producing of someone else's unpaid labor would thus become impossible, and this would put an end to capitalist production altogether. So far as the powers of nature, indicated by Ricardo, are concerned, it is true that these are partly to be had for nothing, and do not cost the capitalist anything. Coal costs him something, but steam costs him nothing, so long as he gets water for free. But now, for example, let us take steam. The properties of steam always exist. Its industrial usefulness is a new scientific discovery which the capitalist has appropriated. As a consequence of this scientific discovery, the productivity of labor, and with it relative surplus value, rose. In other words, the quantity of unpaid labor which the capitalist appropriated from a day's labor grew with the aid of steam. The difference between the productive power of steam and that of the soil is thus only that the one yields unpaid labor to the capitalist and the other to the landowner, who does not take it away from the worker but from the capitalist. The capitalist is therefore so enthusiastic about this element belonging to no one. Only this much is correct. Assuming the capitalist mode of production, then the capitalist is not only a necessary functionary, but the dominating functionary in production. The landowner, on the other hand, is quite superfluous in this mode of production. Its only requirement is that land should not be common property, that it should confront the working class as a condition of production, not belonging to the working class, and the purpose is completely fulfilled if it becomes state property, i.e. if the state draws the rent. The landowner, such an important functionary in production in the ancient world and in the Middle Ages, is a useless superfluity in the industrial world. The radical bourgeois, with an eye moreover to the suppression of all other taxes, therefore goes forward theoretically to a refutation of the private ownership of the land, which, in the form of state property, he would like to turn into the common property of the bourgeois class, that is, of capital. But in practice, he lacks the courage, since an attack on one form of property, a form of the private ownership of a condition of labor, might cast considerable doubts on the other form. Besides, the bourgeois
himself has become an owner of land. Okay, we've gone on quite a bit here. Yes, spheres of production can be synonymous with departments, indeed. And the description of Department 1 and Department 2 can be aggregates of multiple firms, etc. So yes, the distinction between Department 1 and Department 2 is to try and identify a whole sector of things that produce and things that distribute or consume. So I think that's what he's trying to work out here within the context of the theories of surplus value. So let me stop share, shut off the live stream. We've been looking at theories of surplus value, chapter 7 and 8. We will begin next week with probably continuing in 8 and then going to chapter 9. Let me thank you for your attention and hope you'll continue looking at this. There's a lot of actually very interesting ideas in here, and Marx is trying to explain without resorting to discussions about certain sectoral differences, marginal differences, a bunch of other things. He's still, I think, getting to the point of trying to describe or differentiate or indicate the restrictions on Ricardo, as a matter of critique, Ricardo's ideas on value and rent. So